Hi everyone, welcome back to week 2 of our 2023 Winging It Quilt Project. If you don't know anything about it, do check out block 1 and you can catch up really easily. This week I'm going to be working on this green stripe fabric. So this is a 20 by 20 centimetre square. This is a 5mm stripe. I've also got a piece of my pattern that has set my colour scheme and a small piece of a contrasting colour. I've got some Bondo web, my embroidery scissors, and I've got a range of threads, and this time I've added in a white. So this is Anchor 001. This is a really bright crisp white. I've also got a dark green, which is Anchor 258. I've got a light green, which is Anchor 255. I've got my blue, which is Anchor 130. I've got my Anchor 46, which is my favourite red, and I've got a yellow, which is Anchor 298. Now, I used these last week. I've marked my seam allowance around the edge, and you could also see I've marked in some borders there. I'm not actually going to use them very much. I've cut out a template which is 3.5 centimetres wide by 4 centimetres deep, but if you want a full template for this block you can get that on our website, and I'll give you the information about that towards the end. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut out some squares on my Bondo web. So I'm making sure that I've got the paper side up, not the glue side, and I'm going to draw around my little square 4 times. We're going to make a block this week which is inspired by our kitchen window looking out onto the garden. So I've cut out my 4 squares and I've got my background piece here. Now this is going to form a window frame, and I've cut this out so that it can fit 4 window panes on and still leave a little bit of border. And I just want something, you don't have to do it blue, I just wanted something that would stand out against the background. And what we're going to do is cut out some motifs from our pattern fabric to form a view. You could do all manner of things with this. You could embroider a view if you wanted to. You could make a scene that is broken up in the 4 window panes. There's loads of different ways of doing it, but what I'm going to do is find some motifs from my pattern and applique them on as window panes. So I'm just finding the little features of my pattern that I like, and I'm working on the back of my fabric, so this is wrong side up. I know the pattern looks fairly clear, but it is the wrong side, and that's where we want to be attaching our Bondo web. Bondo web is quite handy because you can see through it. I'm just positioning my squares so that the details on my pattern fabric are nicely framed inside the square. Got a sort of bug there, a moth, and I think I've got a butterfly down at the bottom, and I think a flower might be nice. I'm just trying to work out, I do quite like this black moth, but I do think the flower might be nice, so I'm going to put that in there. Now I'm going to get in my ironing pad and I'm just double checking that my squares are nicely positioned, and what I'm going to do is just press that piece of Bondo web onto the back of my fabric. So I'm just making sure it's lined up. I don't want it to move, so I'm going to just clamp that iron down and not move it around, because the Bondo web will fit neatly under the plate of the iron, and if I move my iron, I risk moving the bondeweb and not quite getting the bondeweb stuck down in the right place, so my motif will be off centre and look strange in the window. So I'm just going to do that for all 4 of the motifs that I've chosen. You need to hold your iron down for about 10 to 15 seconds, and it's really important that you make sure that the glue side of the bondeweb is down on the back of the fabric rather than up, otherwise all you'll do is fuse your bondeweb to your iron. Now I don't want to stick it to my ironing mat, so I'm just going to trim the corner there so that the corner of the bondeweb doesn't overhang the edge of the fabric, because I don't want to create a mess on my fabric. That's my last one. So really important that you're working on the back here, otherwise you're going to bondeweb your fabric wrong side up when you come to attach it to your window pane. So now I'm going to cut round the edges, so you'll notice that I cut out my bondeweb rectangles roughly, and that way when we cut them out precisely we will have glue right to the very edge of the pieces that we're going to applique on. Now I'm going to keep this scrap of fabric. I have no idea when this is going to come in useful. I'm keeping every single scrap, and that will go into my scraps collection for this quilt. That will come in useful. So I've got my background fabric, and this is 8.5 centimeters wide. I've cut it so that I've got a border all the way around, and it's 9.5 centimeters deep. And what I'm going to do is just mark 0.5 centimeters in from the edge, because that's the size of my border. I just want a guide to make sure that when I applique my window panes on to this backing piece that they're fairly even. So I'm just marking 0.5 centimeter marks top and bottom on the long edges, and now I'm going to do the same on the short edges. I don't have to draw big long lines, I just need a marker that will just help me position my pieces, and if I line each piece up with those 2 marks, then the centre markers will be correct. So when you're removing the paper backing from bondeweb, it helps to give it a little tear, and that gives you something to get a hold of. And I'm just going to try and arrange these in a way that is pleasing. So I don't want a flower floating in the air, I'm putting that on the bottom, and I don't want everything flying out of my window design, so I'm just arranging those, and I've spread out the colours so that the motifs that have got red on them are diagonally opposite each other, and the ones that are predominant yellow are in the other 2 corners, and I'm just pressing those down, and that will hold in place. Now you could, if you wanted to, bondeweb the whole of the back, but I think that's a waste of bondeweb. We are going to be sewing anyway, and so this is just a little nifty trick that I've worked out. What I'm going to do is almost blue tack it down, so I've just got a little scrap of bondeweb here, and I'm going to put 4 little pieces on the back of my window frame and use it almost like push pins or blue tack to just hold the fabric in place while I'm embroidering on it. This isn't going to be a secure bond by itself, but it just stops me having to use pins and will just hold that fabric in place while I'm working on it. So I've got 4 little tabs there, just taking off the backing paper. A little bit trickier because I can't tear this one, but if you're just patient, you'll catch the edge there. They are really static, so you can see one stuck to my finger there. It's really hard to get off. They just want to stick to you all the time. So that's that. And you can see I marked in some guidelines there. Now you could put it straight, and that's what I intended, but I decided in the end to just offset it. And if you do get the pattern from our website, it is offset, so you can make the choice for yourself. I just think that the quilt blocks are square, and I didn't want too many just straight right angles on the quilt, so I think offsetting it a little bit might be nice. Now those guidelines aren't wasted because they're helping me position my window pane so that it's away from where the seam allowance will be, and it's just a bit of guide for me, so I'm just tilting it off square there. And I think the other advantage to putting it on an angle is if your stripes aren't exactly at right angles, if you put your window at a right angle, it's going to really emphasize the inaccuracy there, so offsetting it disguises any imperfections in your cutting. So I'm going to use some white thread, and I've shown you how to pull from a skein with DMC threads before. With DMC you pull from the number end, but with anchor you pull from the end with the logo. So I'm going to find the anchor, find the loose end that's near the anchor, and just pull from there, and it should just pull without knotting. And you can use your thread straight from the skein, you don't have to decant it onto a peg or a bobbin. So what I thought would be nice is to put some blanket stitch around the edge, and blanket stitch is another loop stitch. So we learnt chain stitch last week. Blanket stitch is actually very similar, but instead of taking your needle back down at the point where your thread came out, you want to imagine a little square, and what we're going to do is create a stitch that forms a right angle around two lines of the square. I will put a tutorial in a card at the top of the screen so you can learn this one specifically. So I'm going to bring my thread up at the top left corner of my imaginary square, and I want to go diagonally down to the bottom right corner, and that's where my needle goes through. So I'm just taking my needle through there and pulling through until I've got a loop on the surface. Now I'm going to bring my needle up in the top right corner of my imaginary square. I'm going to make sure my needle is coming up inside that loop. Now you can do this in one motion, you'll see me doing that soon, but this is to help you get your head around how to form the stitch. Then when I pull my working thread, it catches that loop and pulls it into a right angle. I want to keep my stitches fairly even, so I'm imagining my next square the same size going diagonally down into the corner, and you can bring your needle out by rocking it, and as long as your loop is passing underneath that needle you will get your blanket stitch. So I'm going to pull it again, and you can see it's formed that little right angle that's now joined up with the first one. This is another looped stitch. It was in our looped stitches tutorial that we did in March last year, and if you can do chain stitch you can totally do blanket stitch. It's really straightforward. So diagonally down to the bottom right corner, up at the top right corner, make sure the loop is caught and pull through, and that gives you your blanket stitch. The key to this stitch is to keep your stitch depth and width even all the way around, and that gives you a really nice regular finish. And it's easy to gauge it on this one because we're using the depth of the window frame as our guide as we stitch along. So you can see how all those stitches are interlocked and joined together, looking really neat and tidy. So I'm just going to stitch along the rest of this side. I can do blanket stitch much faster than this. It's actually, once you get into a rhythm, it's really quick. But like we said last week in block 1, this is an heirloom project. I hope to keep this quilt for the rest of my life, and I want it to look neat and tidy. I want to get it right. There is absolutely no reason to rush this, and so I'm just taking my time, making sure my stitches are really neat. Now I'm getting really close to the corner here, and I want to show you how to work a corner in blanket stitch. So I'm going to put my last stitch in along this side, making sure that it's evenly spaced between the previous stitch and the final edge of that backing piece. I'm going to bring my needle up there so that the corner stitches are going to be evenly spaced. Now I'm going to take my needle back in the same hole. We're going to work a little trio of stitches around the corner. So my needle goes back in the same hole that it went in for the previous stitch, just on the corner there of my window pane. And I'm going to bring my needle diagonally out, pointing in the same direction that the corner is pointing in, and I'm going to pull my working thread in that direction as well, just making sure the loop is passing over the fabric and not underneath it, because if it goes underneath it, it's going to lift up your applique piece and make it come loose from the surface. So you can see I've got my little triangle stitch there. Now I'm going to go back in the same hole again, but this time I'm going to come up on the next edge at a right angle, catch the loop in and pull through. And so now you can see we've got sort of just evening that up a little bit. Might take a little bit of fiddling around just to get it precise, but once you've got it, it will stay there. So now you can see I've got this little back-to-back triangle arrangement forming a diamond at the corner, and that actually just gives you a really neat sharp finish at your corners. And now I'm on my next edge. I've swung around the corner, and so now I can just work along the next edge as if nothing happened. So I'm just going to carry on working in my blanket stitches all the way around my window pane. Now I've almost run out of thread here, so I thought I'd just come back and show you how to finish off a thread and start a new one. So I've made my last stitch there, and I'm just making sure it's pulled nice and tight. I'm going to take my needle down just the other side of the loop that I've caught. So I've got my thread passing around the corner there, and I'm just going to hop over the top. Managed to unthread my needle there, just thread that back up. So I'm just going to jump over that little loop that I've caught and take my needle down just the other side. You can barely see that, so it's like an anchor stitch that we use at the end of chain stitch. And as usual, I haven't left enough thread for me to finish off properly. This is a habit of mine, you'll see me do this a lot. So I'm just going to loop through there. I'm passing underneath the previous stitch and going through the loop, and that forms a little knot. I can trim that off, and now I've got my new thread with a knot in the end, and this time I'm going to bring my needle up just inside that last stitch. So I'm coming up inside the previous blanket stitch. Hope you can see there. There we go, that's really close. So that way it's going to appear like the thread is continuing, and I'm going to make my next blanket stitch, pull through, and you can see it creates an almost invisible join, really. So that's how to start a new thread. I'm going to carry on all the way around. So I've stitched all the way around now. I'm back to the beginning, and I'm just going to put in my last stitch. So I want to keep it evenly spaced. It's a little bit short actually, but I want a space left that is 2 stitch widths along, and I'm going to form my last blanket stitch so that it covers the thread where I started, and I'm going to pull through so that my last stitch sits over the start of the thread. Then I'm going to hop over the loop that I've caught again, just like we did when we ended our thread before, pull through, and that covers up your starting point, and again is a fairly subtle end point. And I'm just going to finish that off on the back, and that secures my thread for my blanket stitch. So you could leave it there. I want to add a little bit more stitching, so I thought I would add some running stitch around my window panes. So I'm just starting my thread, and I'm just going to stitch just inside the edge of my appliqued pieces there. Now, Bondaweb on cotton is a fairly secure join. It joins cotton almost permanently, but this quilt will be washed and used, and I don't want over time for these pieces to work themselves loose. So apart from the decorative element, this is going to help those pieces stay in place forever. So I've added those in now. I thought it looked a little bit empty, and I thought it might be fun to have some quotes about gardens across our quilt, and I found this lovely quote from Audrey Hepburn. It says, "To plant a garden is to believe in tomorrow," and I've put this onto the pattern that's available on our website, but I wanted to capture my handwriting, so I've just handwritten this. I was trying to decide what colour to stitch it in. None of the colours I'd chosen worked, and I noticed that there's this dark grey green in the patterned fabric, and I found a thread to match. It's Anchor 683, so I thought that would be a nice one to add in. So I'm just going to stitch over my handwriting here in 2 strands of this thread. I've been using 2 strands all the way through this project, and my favourite stitch for lettering is a whipped back stitch. So I'm just going to back stitch in. You can see I've come up there just shy of the end of the letter T, and I've gone back on myself, then forward 2 stitches, and then back on myself, forward 2 stitch lengths, and then back to meet the previous stitch. I've just worked all the way around that letter T there. I'm just going to put in the bar of the T there, just 2 stitches worth. So I've come up at the end and I've gone back to the centre. I will link a tutorial for backstitch at the top of the screen there. And I've come up at the other end and back to the centre. I find that's the easiest way to do the crosses on my T's. Now I'm going to whip that back stitch. So I'm going to bring my needle up at the very end of the line that I've stitched in place, and I'm going to slide my needle underneath the stitch, passing from right to left. And then I'm going to go to my next stitch and pass my needle under from right to left again. And whipped back stitch is always going to pass the needle underneath the stitch in the same direction, so I'm always going to be passing from right to left. I know it looked like left to right there, but I've turned the fabric so that I can get the angle. And I'm just going to do the same with the cross on the T. So I'll add whipped back stitch in a card at the top as well, so you can learn both of those stitches. It's a much slower and closer tutorial if you're totally mystified by what I've just done. So there we go. I'm just going to repeat that process on the O. So let me explain it again. I come up wherever I want to start, and I'm going to work backwards 1 stitch length. Then I'm going to come forwards 2 stitch lengths, so there's now a gap between the previous stitch and my new stitch, and then I go back to where my first stitch left off. Then forward again, and then back to meet my previous stitch. Forward again, and back to meet my previous stitch. Bit of faffing about there to make sure it's on the line. Rounded letters need a little bit of concentration, otherwise you end up getting quite spiky letters. Whipped back stitch is really good though, because if there is any unevenness in your back stitching, the whipping process seems to just even it all out and pull your stitches into shape. So again, I'm passing my needle underneath the stitch, so I'm not going through the fabric, I'm just going underneath the stitch, and I'm going in the same direction, so inside to outside, all the way around that letter. And I find with rounded letters, it helps to just go just beyond where you started. So I could finish off my thread there, but I'm just going to go through that stitch where I started one more time, and then I can take my thread to the back of the fabric, and that's my first letter. I just love whipped back stitch as a stitch for lettering. You can do whatever lettering you like. So that's all my lettering put in place. We've done our window with our 4 panes using motifs from our pattern fabric with a bit of stitching, and then we've got our little quote in the corner, and that just adds a little bit more interest, and it's just picking out that colour that is the darkest colour in my pattern fabric. I hope you've enjoyed that. If you have, please do give us a like. It really helps us. It helps other people find our video and join in the project. And I would really love to see your creations. If you want to post, use hashtag FSH23quilt, and so that we can see all of our block 2s together, you could also add hashtag FSH23quilt2. There is a small charge of £1 to download the pattern. It just helps cover the costs of making these videos and keep our channel running. And you can find that on our website, which is at the address at the bottom of the screen. I'll also link it below. If you've enjoyed this project and you want something similar, you can click on this video here, and I'll put a video up here that's best for you. If you'd like to subscribe, click on the button below, and that makes it really easy for you. So a different panel this week. Hope you've enjoyed that, and I'll see you next week for block 3. Thanks for watching. Bye.